Welcome, everybody, to GoodFellows, a show where we talk about economics, politics, national security, and matters of current concern. I'd like to welcome my fellow GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, historian, H.R. McMaster, general and all-around optimist. I'm John Cochrane, an economist. Our normal host, Bill Whalen, is out this week. So in the theory of putting the inmates in charge of the asylum, they made me moderator. And we're a special welcome to our friend Glenn Loury, a professor of economics at Brown and also distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Welcome, Glenn. Let's have some fun. Yeah. As much of a theme as we could put together is that there's so much in the week's news we have to talk about, but it also seems a little bit of a reprise of that 70s show. Are we going down the same path as we went before, maybe this time with farce? So let's lead it off with what seems to be in the news, and I'll lead off with Glenn. We had the Rittenhouse verdict, the week in wokeism, and much other news in that direction. I won't even bother with a question. 3, 2, 1, Glenn, go.
Well, chickens come home to roost, or the tale continues. The summer of 2020, the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the rioting and protesting that occurred after that, Rittenhouse, the young man from Illinois who shot dead 2 and wounded seriously a 3rd in an altercation there. His trial, the press on trial for misreporting and a biased and tendentious rendering of the facts, the risk of civil disturbance if the verdict didn't come out right in the trial, all of this. I don't know where to begin, to be honest with you, John. I'm struck by the fact that mobs gather around courthouses in this country, sometimes, edged on by unscrupulous politicians, and that people of the sort that Jacob Blake would appear to have been can become heroic figures and symbols of movements of social justice. I'm struck by that, but I don't know. I want to know what you guys think. Actually, this is all I do. All I do all day long is talk about this kind of stuff. I'm the guy who has to report that the country has gone mad if you're going to celebrate the likes of Jacob Blake. And if you think that what happened to him, given all the facts, thorough investigation by responsible parties, was an event of his own making. I could go into the details, and that a city should burn because of that event, that politicians should equivocate in their defense of the institutions of civil order. I'm struck by where we've gotten to here in this country, and I'm actually very alarmed by it.
Well, as you mentioned, I probably shouldn't have let it so open because there's 100 interesting issues to follow here. The city's falling apart, the police, criminal trials, the rights of defendants, even the president of the United States weighing in on how trials should come out without looking at the evidence. And the fact I've noticed, so I listened to NPR's coverage, which featured Ibrahim X. Kendi, your friend, who painted the trial itself, not the Blake murder, but the trial itself as evidence of white supremacists wandering around the country, which strikes me as the thing, one of the many things to notice about this sort of paranoid conspiracy theory on the left, that there are groups of white supremacists running around trying to take over our democracy.
I like the fact that one of the British newspapers ran as a headline that the victims, the people who were shot, were Black, which tells you all you need to know about the quality of some journalism these days. David French wrote an excellent piece on this subject, which aligned with my views so perfectly that I don't need to say any more than read the piece. His 2 points were justice was done. The verdict was the right one from the vantage point of the law, but that Kyle Rittenhouse is no hero. And I apply the simple test did he behave in a way that I wanted one of my sons to behave? And the answer is no, because he behaved in a foolish and reckless fashion. To make him a hero seems to me a grave mistake.
He's as poor a hero for the right as Jacob Blake is for the left. You're technically, yes, it was self-defense, but what the hell are you doing grabbing a gun, going out and looking for trouble?
I would just add, and I know we'll probably talk more about this, but the real indictment is of the media, I think. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm a big Margaret Brennan and Face the Nation fan. I think they do a pretty good job relative to other Sunday shows. But the coverage last Sunday was so skewed and misleading in connection with this being an issue fundamentally of race rather than one of poor judgment. And clearly, given the implication, if one had not known anything else about this case, you would have thought that those who Rittenhouse shot were Black, and this was a racial issue. So I think that what really I'm concerned about is if we're ever going to help bring the country back together, right, reverse some of this polarization that we've seen, we at least need kind of a common set of facts. And you think we could rely on our mainstream media to provide those, especially when they're not available, certainly in the pseudo media or in social media. So I'm really worried about the Fourth Estate. And I wonder if any of the leaders within the Fourth Estate recognize the need for some very serious reforms. Of course, our friend Barry Weiss has written eloquently about this and is providing an alternative on Substack. Glenn, you're the media that you're producing and the clear, concise assessment of what's going on today, I think is immensely important. I think more and more Americans are just going to have to migrate away from mainstream media and go to some of these alternatives. Glenn, what's your view of the media? Is it redeemable? And what do you think could be done to help reform the Fourth Estate?
I have no idea how to reform the media. I don't think that the law is going to be an effective instrument, except insofar as people bring libel or slander actions against news organizations that misrepresent them in an egregious way. I wanted to say, though, that I think in a way it was indirectly a racial incident, even though in the Rittenhouse shooting case, all of the parties, both he and the people who were shot were white. In that, of course, the whole scene was in the aftermath of the rioting and looting and arson and disorder and violence that erupted after the Jacob Blake shooting. It was a piece with other incidents that had occurred in other cities around the country during that long, hot summer of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And the debate before the country about how are we to respond to this lawlessness, with Trump running for re-election, sitting in the White House, using the incidents as a platform for his own political expression, and with Biden and Harris running against him, again, using these incidents as a platform for their own political aspiration. Sort of the question was drawn and people had to decide what side they were on, so that defense of Rittenhouse indirectly becomes an attack on Black Lives Matter and a characterization of the protest as unacceptable or violent, and a siding with the prosecution in the Rittenhouse case becomes a way of expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter and so on. And this causes me great despair, because as everybody knows who's listening to this broadcast, on Sunday, the 21st, a Black man, Darrell Brooks, who has been apprehended driving a vehicle into a Christmas Day parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is in suburban Milwaukee, killing 5 people and injuring dozens. Now, this will be investigated. I don't know exactly what all of the causes and so forth might have been, but I do know that the person in custody is Black. I also know that it's completely irrelevant that the person in custody is Black. I also know that the kids who were run over by this guy were white. And I know that it's completely irrelevant that they were white. And I think we're in a hell of a terrible place in this country if every time a Black criminal drives a vehicle and murders white people, we talk about it in the way that I'm talking about it right now. And yet that's the world that's being invited by these opportunistic politicians and irresponsible journalists who every time a cop does something that's questionable to a citizen, want to tell me about a white cop and a Black citizen. We don't need that. It's not necessary. It's gratuitous.
And there's an arguable case that the cops shoot white people more than they ought to. I mean, there is a serious issue of police reform. Police do harass Black people more than they should, but that isn't necessarily a wave of murder and white supremacy. It's a problem of too much policing. You had a beautiful essay on all these questions, which I want to I want to turn to or encourage you to talk about, both on what actually happened last summer and on the troubles of police and the Black community, and in some sense, what if we actually care about Black advancements, Black neighborhoods, Black communities, how this particular narrative is counterproductive at best.
Yeah. The first point I wanted to make is that we need to keep the killing by police of Black citizens in perspective. And the idea that there's open season on Black people, this is what Benjamin Crump, the lawyer, calls his book Open Season. The police are going around killing Black people en masse, or the idea, as Al Sharpton would have it, that America has its knee on the neck of Black folks and it needs to take its knee off. The suggestion that as an African-American, I have to worry about my physical safety if I step from my door because rogue cops are there who might set upon me, the kind of thing that millionaire Black celebrities like LeBron James talk about all the time, that it's, well, a lie, that it's a false characterization of the objective circumstance, that we're a country of 300 plus million people, that there are tens of thousands of arrests that take place every day, that in every one of these cases, nearly every one of them that you go down the list, with a few exceptions, you have people in open, violent conflict with the police, provoking actions that lead to their own, to either demise or to their own injury, as in the case of Jacob Blake. And that the politicization of this thing, the racial politicization of policing, is objectively contrary to the interests of rank and file Black people who can't afford to purchase the security for themselves by moving out of neighborhoods in which there's a lot of crime that's taking place. They need the cops. Of course, the cops are not perfect. Obviously, policing has to be regulated. And sure, they step afoul and they should be held accountable for what they do. But the way in which this issue has been seized upon as a device for undermining the credibility and the effectiveness and legitimacy of policing across the board is deeply disturbing and very wrongheaded. It's contrary to the interests of Black people.
Let me ask you, so in some sense, last summer's story was riots, which we can take our views on, and going back and looking at the videos is a little bit shocking as a memory of what actually happened. It's left in its wake a bunch of devastation. This summer's story seems to be rampant lawlessness, groups of organized looters going out and emptying out stores, the emptying out of cities. Where do you see things in the current situation?
I have a correspondent whom I respect, is a man named Clifton Roscoe, and I published some of his stuff at my newsletter, at my Substack newsletter sometime, but he calls it the big sort. He's quoting somebody who you guys probably know. I can't name the book, but the fact that people are moving, people can vote with their feet, people can isolate themselves from these adverse developments in the cities. So I think there's a lot of that. I mean, I can't believe that many decent, moderate people, they will be white or whatever, looking at what's actually going on in St. Louis, in Baltimore, in Chicago, and like places, are not saying to themselves, I'm not going to have a darn thing to do with this. I'm not going to open up a business on the corner. I'm not going to invest in property there. I don't want my children any place near what's going on. I can't help but think that they're thinking that. And calling them racists, wagging our fingers in their faces, that's not going to be a particularly effective persuasive strategy to get them to buy into the kind of cooperative political economic social that we need in order to stabilize the cities and so forth. So,
HR Neil, I've been asking too many questions. When are you guys ask a question?
Well, let me qualify something that you said a moment ago, John. First, if one looks back on last year and looks at the data, there was a lot of non-violent protest. Not all the protests were violent. There were about a half of the protests where there were reports of violence. Whether those reports were accurate is another matter. That's important. Secondly, when we talk about a wave of crime, I think we have to be precise. There has been a big increase in homicide that dates from those protests and has continued into this year in multiple cities. There are some cities which also have a broader problem of crime, such as San Francisco, but that's because the local authorities have essentially legalized shoplifting so that it is possible to engage in low-level crime with basically no penalty. But I think the broader national problem is this jump in homicide numbers, which seems to be quite widespread as far as I can tell from the recent data. And this is interesting if we take a step back. And I always like to do that because I don't want to get too bogged down in one case. If we take a step back, it's very interesting that the United States had this increase in homicide because it hasn't happened in other countries in the course of the pandemic. In fact, in most countries, one effect of lockdowns was to reduce crime. It's much harder to commit a crime if everybody is actually supposed to be at home. So the US is an outlier in this respect. Historically, we're still way below the peaks of homicide in the very violent times, 70s, 80s, 90s. But this big increase is a very interesting and unusual trend. And I think it has a big political consequence. It's one of the things that I think should really worry Democrats as they look ahead to next year, because if they are associated, as they became last year, with defund the police, and the demoralization of the police is closely linked to this increase in homicide, then I think it's going to be very, very hard for them to lose that association with being on the wrong side of the law and order issue. It's been a chronic problem of social democratic parties, but especially of the Democratic Party in the United States. And I think Republicans should be able to capitalize on this. And that's one reason why people have made so much, I think, of the Kyle Rittenhouse case, because it's really an opportunity to make this, like everything else in the country, a political issue, even although it's essentially a case in law.
Neil, isn't a lot of the homicide in the U.S. relative to other countries the fact that our cities are run by gangs? I don't think other countries have quite the gang culture or issues that we have.
Well, there are gangs. I grew up in a city, Glasgow, which was notorious for its gangs, but they didn't have guns. Violence is much harder to do. Lethal violence is harder to do if all you've got are knives and even less sophisticated weapons. The thing that differentiates the US from most Western countries and makes it like a Latin American country, makes it more like Brazil, is just there are lots and lots of firearms.
But we also, I wouldn't discount the shoplifting. So you drive down San Francisco and store after store is boarded up. And Glenn and I grew up in the Chicago of the 1970s, where store after store was boarded up. If you don't have any retail, you don't have any community, you don't have any jobs, you have more crime. And that's just and people move out because there's no amenities. That seems to be, I think there's still plenty of reason to worry about cities, even though rich people can pack up and move out to the suburbs if they like it. Are we at peak woke? Also in the news was the Virginia governor's race. In academia, finally people stood up on the Dorian Abbott affair. You guys are both starting this wonderful, interesting new University of Austin. Are we seeing some light at the end of the tunnel in the sort of the Maoist wokeism thread?
Well, let me draw a distinction right away. I'm one of the founders, and Glenn is an advisor, so he bears much less responsibility for anything that we may do right or wrong. I think the answer to your question is no, we're not at peak woke. Otherwise, we wouldn't really need to do this. The climate in universities across the nation, and I think beyond the United States, has become really quite shockingly illiberal in recent years. I would say this has been a phenomenon, especially of the last 5 years. This is well documented by surveys, by institutions like Heterodox Academy. 62% of students feel they can't speak their mind on campus nationwide. That doesn't seem like a healthy state of affairs. And I think all of us who spend time on campuses, as we do as Hoover Fellows, know that this is a very fraught time in academia. Indeed, it's clear from what universities say about themselves that they know there's a problem. People feel like they're walking on eggshells. And academics are losing their jobs or being driven to resign by the kind of policies that are pursued often by bureaucrats rather than their fellow academics. So a group of us felt earlier this year that it was time to do something, to create a new institution, to model academic freedom, to show that it's possible to have real academic freedom where people can say silly things in the pursuit of understanding them better. And that by doing this, we do two things. First of all, we create a refuge for those academics like Peter Boghossian who are being run off their campuses. Peter was forced to resign by Portland State the other day after a sustained campaign against him because he dared to point out that bogus academic journals were publishing bogus articles. In my view, he's one of the heroes of our time. So we needed to create a place for people like him, or Kathleen Stock, who was driven off the campus at Sussex University in England because of her views on the difference between men and women, in the same way that the New School in the 1930s was a place that refugees from a different kind of illiberalism could come. But the other, I think, broader goal is to just show the established university how it's done. And if we can raise the standards of academic freedom and attract students who want to go to universities where they can speak their minds, then maybe, just maybe, we can achieve peak wokeism. But it's not going to happen by itself. This is not a pendulum that just swings back by itself. That is why ultimately I felt I had to get involved in creating a new institution.
I think Glenn and I, as economists, will always cheer that competition is the answer to all problems. If the institutions of civil society are taken over by the wokes, then create new institutions. But here's where my worry is. Everybody hates competition. And the woke revolution is starting to discover it hates democracy, which is the form of political competition. So certainly won't they pull out all the stops to try to stop you? For example, you have to compete against federal subsidies. You have to somehow get accredited. You have to get people to hire your students. You have a hard road ahead of you on the forces that want to shut you down.
Well, I don't suppose the Renaissance was easy either. I mean, in the end,
ask Galileo.
He said modestly.
Established institutions, particularly in higher education, have a centuries-long history of resisting change and trying to impose orthodoxy. So nobody went into this with any illusions. I remember saying to my fellow founders, we will get an astonishing amount of negative press the minute we reveal that we're doing this. And I've seen this movie before because I was involved in an attempt to create a new university in London some years ago. Anthony Grayling dreamt up the idea of a new College of the Humanities that would be a kind of Oxbridge-style institution in London. And from the very word go, the press went after him and went after the idea, because they know they can kill these things in the cradle. The defenders of the status quo know that if they can do enough reputational damage in the first inning, then the institution won't be able to attract faculty, and above all, it won't be able to attract students. This time is different, though. In the week after we said we were going to do this, we had more than 3,000 emails from professors asking when they could apply for jobs at the University of Austin, and more than 5,000 emails from students asking when they could apply to come and study at the University of Austin. I think that things have really changed a lot in the last few years. You alluded to the Virginia gubernatorial election. The pandemic revealed to people what their kids were studying, not only in college, but in high school, and they did not like what they were overhearing on Zoom. And this means that there's a new mood in the country, a realization that something has gone badly wrong at many universities, at maybe most universities, and that there needs to be some change of mood, change of direction. That's what we're trying to achieve. Of course, we can't compete with Stanford or Harvard or Yale in the early years, but ultimately, all of these institutions had to start somewhere. Even Oxford was once upon a time a tiny institution on the banks of the River Thames. No university starts, as it were, as an Ivy League superstar institution. This is a startup. And although we've had negative press, you know what's really struck me? I don't know if you noticed this, Glenn. The quality of arguments against our doing this is amazingly low. I've rarely read such junk as the critiques. And let's face it, who really credibly can argue against an institution whose sole function is to model academic freedom? I mean, good luck making the case against academic freedom. But of course, the usual smear is, oh, this is just a vast right-wing conspiracy. It's just a conservative institution, despite the fact that our advisors are clearly a bipartisan group. So I think the arguments against it have been lame. In fact, I saw a couple of pieces that if they'd been undergraduate essays, I would have given an F.
Well, except we don't give grades anymore, Neil. So
well, I want to think one thing we'll certainly be doing at the University of Austin and looking at
let me just say one thing, John,
Please.
just very briefly, because we are economists. There used to be a field called industrial organization. I actually published some papers early in my career where you write down models and you try to think about competition. And you think about barriers to entry, and you think about, intangible assets and things of this kind. And, reputation, how do you get to be a Harvard or a Princeton? That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. And there are a lot of junctures. This accreditation challenge is a real challenge, and it's very politicized. But I'm on board. I'm happy to be an advisor. I'm encouraged by Neil's enthusiasm and his passion. I'm mindful of the fact that the move that we're making, institutional innovation, to try to create something that's free from all of the corruption and the degradation, is in a way also a kind of signal. And you see that in some of the critiques. I agree that they haven't been of particularly high quality, but what I've been catching a lot is who is against the left in the culture wars. It is Trump type people. You guys making a move against the left in the university culture wars are giving aid and comfort to that strand in American politics. And then they go for your, it's ad hominem, which I regret to say is perhaps why some of the very distinguished original advisors of the effort have stepped away, because they're worried that they'll be tainted, even though it's unwarranted by this kind of reputational blowback.
Glenn, and this is an area where I think deserves some more work, right? Is this effort to co-opt the right or the conservative movement, by the Trump movement, right? The Tucker Carlsons of the world, who I think are guilty of an equal and opposite irrational reaction to the far left. And it is diminishing, I think, the right's ability to provide a corrective in sort of a dialectic that would help Americans come to some sort of a reasonable synthesis. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Neil's thoughts, and John's thoughts about what's happening on the right with the co-option of those who would be a rational voice against the left, but instead, what we hear is a reaction that actually adds to this, I think, centripetal forces, right? These centripetal forces that are pulling us apart from one another.
Well, before we get to that, HR, let me make one point which is really important, and that is that politics has no real place in the lecture room, in the classroom, in my view. And this was a point Max Weber, the great German sociologist, made many, many years ago in a very important lecture. And Weber's argument was that politics is not something that you should really be doing in the classroom. Of course, you can study politics, but it's not the role of a professor to exploit the power and influence of the lectern to indoctrinate. In fact, it shouldn't be possible for somebody to tell from what a professor says what his or her politics actually is. And that's a really important principle for me. I've always tried to make sure that when I'm in the classroom, I'm not wearing my polemicist's hat. I'm wearing a different hat. So whatever else the University of Austin is, it's not a conservative institution, nor is it a liberal institution. It is an institution, and we've said this again and again, that pursues truth and believes that academic freedom, freedom of speech, those things are indispensable for the successful pursuit of truth. I was asked, will we have students study critical race theory? And my answer was yes. They should be able to study whatever is relevant to their pursuit of truth. What we won't have is people indoctrinating students with their ideology. That I'm against.
Well, I think the message to undergraduates that sells well is that, hey, if anybody asks you to adhere to any orthodoxy, reject that, right? And make your own choices, your own decisions. Read widely, question, anything that you hear, and suspend judgment for a while until you've mastered a particular topic. So I think that does well at Stanford and elsewhere. Is if we, especially amongst students who feel as if they've been fed an orthodoxy and have been asked to adhere to it.
Okay, I'm going to take on my moderator's hat. I want to pivot.
Yes.
HR has gotten off too easy. We got two more topics to talk about today. I want to talk about foreign affairs, what's going on in the last couple of weeks, and then I want to pivot back to economics, where Neil has recently completely outdone every economist I've ever seen on analyzing the recent situation. So he'll get to do that. But let's turn to foreign policy and wake up now, HR. I've seen a lot going on, and also to Glenn, a lot that has an economic component to it. One, of course, Russian troops are massing on the Ukraine border. Maybe the GoodFellows picked the wrong war to worry about over the last couple of months. The Biden administration is talking about forswearing first use of nuclear weapons. China is merving, we're not. So the whole issue of mutual assured destruction and how does that work, that whole game theory is back in the news. And I gather our Navy can't sail close enough to China that the planes do any good because we forgot to build long enough range planes to do that. Finally, a great piece of news I heard this morning, from my point of view. The U.S. ran joint military exercises with Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. Israel and the Arabs together running military exercises. Okay, pick and choose, HR. What's going on?
Hey, well, the war in Ukraine never stopped, right? It's been going on since 2014. We haven't been paying attention to it. And what's changed, I think, are a number of things. I think Putin, like Xi Jinping, senses a degree of weakness in the West generally and in the United States specifically. He's also faced with the stagnant economy and a really horrible response to COVID, and people just getting tired of Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, he's extended his rule till 2036. And I think it's these domestic pressures which has, I think, impelled him toward maybe creating another or accelerating, the actions he's taken before and creating another international crisis. Combine really the massing of troops around the borders of Ukraine in a way that really is menacing in a real way. I mean, and I think the chances are significant of a renewed offensive in the Donbass region. But also look at what he's done in Belarus by weaponizing migrants against Poland, and of course, the using energy for coercive purposes against Europe. So I think he just feels as if the West is weak, and then he also has domestic problems that he can maybe best solve by really through jingoistic nationalism and creating some kind of international crisis.
So what should we be doing about it?
Well, I think we have to deter him. We have to make sure that he knows that we would impose costs on him far beyond those he would factor in at the outset of any kind of aggression against Ukraine, for example. I think we have to demonstrate more solidarity with Ukraine, us and the Europeans in particular. And we have to deploy capabilities in the region such that he knows his efforts to intimidate not only Ukraine, but others like Bulgaria and Romania by trying to turn, the Black Sea into a Russian lake, that's not going to work. And you alluded to, the Chinese capabilities. They're very similar to the Russian capabilities. What they've done really since the 90s, but accelerating in the 2000s, is develop a range of asymmetric capabilities, which are designed to limit our freedom of movement and action along the Eurasian rimland. And maybe I'll ask Neil to comment about this, but I think the situation that we're facing today is quite analogous to the situation that Great Britain faced in the early 1900s. In that, with Mackinder and Spikeman, these geostrategic theorists said we should never allow a hostile power to dominate the world island of the Eurasian landmass. And I think that's what we're seeing China and Russia attempting to do, attempting to create exclusionary areas of primacy. And then to use this military intimidation, whether it's a buildup of nuclear forces you mentioned with China or menacing deployments of conventional forces, to essentially send the message of who's your daddy, right? To weaker states on the rimland, and to create positions of geostrategic advantage. They're also competing further afield than Eurasian landmass, and we could talk more about the Middle East and so forth or South Asia as an arena of competition. But I think we're in the midst of an intensifying geostrategic competition, and what you're seeing is Russia really accelerating what was already a sustained campaign associated with Russian new generation warfare. And you see China taking a series of aggressive actions as well, vis-a-vis Taiwan and in the South China Sea or in the Himalayan frontier.
So I have a way of linking what we're saying now to what we were saying before. And it's kind of a question for Glenn. And the question is, who cares? So clearly, HR is right. The combination of the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation is a very dangerous one for just about any relatively weak country within range of them. And it's a very dangerous one for the United States because it implies a challenge to American primacy. The United States, I think, is more like Britain between the wars in the sense that it is pretty thinly spread, now has a great burden of debt weighing it down, which is going to squeeze the defense budget, and yet could face simultaneous challenges over Taiwan, over Ukraine, and maybe also in the Persian Gulf. If even two of those happen simultaneously, as you know, HR, be really tough. But my question for Glenn is, who cares? In other words, does the American public, preoccupied as it is with the Kyle Rittenhouse case, with wokeism, does the American public actually pay much attention if we wake up to the amphibious invasion of Taiwan, or we wake up to hear that the Russians have launched a major offensive aiming to annex Ukraine entirely to the Russian Federation? I still can't get a handle on, maybe it's because I'm an immigrant, what do I know? But I just can't get a handle on whether Americans would really care if these bad scenarios played out. What do you think, Glenn?
I guess it's not so much. My guess is they're more worried about the price of gasoline or whatever. My guess is we should care. I'm no expert in the field, but my sense of the matter is that what starts as a little bit of slippage ends up at the end of the day being something much, much more serious. I do have some sympathy for those who say, why are we taking on ourselves the burden of being the world's policeman and so on? This is above my pay grade as far as diplomacy is concerned about how you work out the various alliances to share the burdens and so on. But I would think that indifference to a kind of inward focus that leaves one not paying much attention to what's happening with Russia and China will, in the fullness of time, be a position that one could live to regret.
Right. Defunding the global police. I mean, in a funny kind of way, defund the global police became the policy under President Obama. And it was continued by President Trump. Each of these presidents, despite their massive differences, basically agreed that we should reduce our involvement in the rest of the world. And this
let me ask a question in return. I mean, do we have the confidence, that is, as a nation, the United States of America, our cultural institutions, our universities, people in the press, and likewise in the corporate sector and so on, the political leadership, do we have enough confidence in the legitimacy and vitality and virtue of the American project that we're willing to fight and die for it?
Glenn, that is the right word, I think, is confidence, right? And, we were talking just before we started filming here about, the 70s show, right? And I'm thinking about, the Carter's malaise speech, in which he never used the word malaise, but it came at the end toward the end of a decade that involved the first resignation of an American president and the scandal associated with it. Humiliating withdrawal from Saigon after the Vietnamese communist assault on Saigon, stagflation, multiple energy crises, and then that decade punctuated by an Iranian revolution and a 444-day long hostage crisis in Iran. So, I mean, I do see the parallels here, and we did lack confidence. But, I'm the optimist, Glenn. So I guess got to ask you, man, will you be optimistic? Are you optimistic with me that we do still have the capacity for self-correction and self-improvement and regaining our confidence as we did, I think, in the 1980s?
What Glenn said was very deep. You have to have the belief that your society is a good and just society and deserves to prevail. And if you buy the woke narrative, then, the Russians deserve to take over. And why should you fight and die for it? That's not throughout America. That's a small fraction, which kind of didn't like us in the 1970s either. And I do think there is hope. Certainly Americans don't pay much attention in the rumblings, but when we lose something big, they care. The defeat in Afghanistan was people hated that. They hated the Iranian hostage crisis. They hated losing Vietnam.
So one of the data points that has fascinated me in the last couple of weeks is a survey that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs published. And it showed that 52% of Americans favor using US troops to defend if China were to invade Taiwan. Now that I found quite surprising. I would have, if you'd asked me before to guess, it would be like maybe 20%. It's actually more than half of Americans. So I think one of the unnoticed shifts that happened in the last 2 years, partly because of the pandemic and the recognition that the pandemic emanated from China for a reason, sentiment towards China has unquestionably shifted. And it's bipartisan. Democrats may not be quite as ready to fight for Taiwan. They're a little bit less ready than Republicans, but this is broadly a shift that's happened across the political spectrum. And it may be something that the Chinese and the Russians are underestimating right now, because it's clear from what the Chinese say to themselves and occasionally in public that they think we're done and that we probably won't put up much of a fight if they do take a risk and send those amphibious landing craft to the beaches of Taiwan.
All of you guys, if Taiwan turns into a shooting war, it's going to be an economic catastrophe, especially if we lose. What's certainly going to happen is there's going to be a blockade of all trade around the Pacific Rim. The most natural thing for the U.S. to do is not to try to reinvade Taiwan, but to send out the Navy and so trade with China is over. Most trade in there is over. I can't only begin to think of how this is going to go, but this is going to be a pocketbook catastrophe. Plus, of course, the U.S. will have to spend a whole lot of money on stuff. Same thing if Europe turns into a shooting war and all sorts of things blow up on the European economy. It's going to have immediate impacts.
Which makes me want to ask, what do the Chinese have to gain from precipitating such an outcome?
Neil, aren't all wars miscalculations? They think they can sneak it in and we won't pay any attention.
This is where I think the World War I analogy, I'll ask Neil to maybe comment on this. I'm thinking of a great essay that Margaret Macmillan wrote called The Rime of History in 2014 on the 100th anniversary of World War I. And of course, all the prominent intellectuals and economists in Europe prior to World War I thought war was impossible, right? Because it wasn't in anyone's interest. But of course, people fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago, right? Fear, honor, and interest. And I think it's really a sense of honor and fear of losing the Communist Party's grip on power that drives Xi Jinping. That's why I think so many of his decisions are inexplicable, right? From an economic perspective, right? If he really wanted to grow the economy at the targeted rates, he would double down on the so-called private sector in China, which doesn't really exist, but he wouldn't be doubling down on state-owned enterprises, for example. So really, he wouldn't have, maybe extended the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong. He wouldn't be persecuting the executives in the tech sector, for example, and make it even less and less attractive for anybody to do business in China. So I really think that to Xi Jinping, it doesn't even enter into his calculus what the economic consequences are. And this is why I think that we ought to make clear to him, hey, if you want access to the dollar economy, and you invade Taiwan, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get access to the dollar economy. You're going to be cut off.
I just want to applaud what you just said because it's so wise. So much of our foreign policy thinking thinks of the other side as this complete, unitary, ready-to-go chess player. In fact, they've got huge internal problems. And if we only understood their internal problems, we might be able to push things around a whole lot better than we do.
Well, maybe to answer Glenn's question, let me quote a Chinese scholar who spoke with a group of us last week at Hoover, who's visiting Stanford. And he said that to understand Xi Jinping, you must not exaggerate his sophistication. You must recognize that his utility function is quite simple. Number one, personal power. Number two, the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And the reason that the Taiwan issue looms so large is actually very simple. Xi Jinping committed himself to bringing Taiwan under the control of Beijing as the capstone of his own career. That was why he persuaded the leadership of the CCP to give him an extension of power, essentially a lifelong position as president. Everything hinges on this move in his own mind because it's the key to his personal power. And in the minds of the CCP leadership, it's the key to their legitimacy as the economy inexorably slows, because there's nothing they can do to stop that. The demographics, the debt dynamics, the fact that 29% or so of economic activity, which is in real estate, is basically no longer sustainable. They're going to a much slower growth rate over the next 5 or so years. And therefore, nationalism is the key. Now, this is where HR's 1914 parallel does make some sense. Sure, completely different political setup, but there's no question that many governments in 1914 made the assumption that their domestic political situation would be improved by going to war and would be weakened if they did not go to war. Such was the power of nationalism. I think that is very much China today.
And not everybody in China, even in the CCP, must be happy with Xi Jinping making himself emperor for life. They had sort of a system. You get 2 terms and then power turns over. People can afford to wait their turn rather than pull out the knives now. I can't imagine that everybody is secretly completely happy with this.
Well, there was a book published earlier this year called The China Coup, which imagined dissident elements at the top of the CCP overthrowing Xi Jinping in a time of economic and financial crisis. But I mean, this seems like wishful thinking to me. I'm not going to say it's a 0% probability, but it's got to be low single digits.
Xi Jinping doesn't think this is a 0% probability for sure.
Right.
Okay. Now, I am an economist. I have studied some game theory. I don't know much about international relations, but I do know that deterrence is a fundamental thing. Why would you be talking about forswearing the first use? And if it needs to be said, I'm not for the first use. I'm not advocating the first use. I'm saying that looks like a card that I would want to have in my hand that the other guy didn't know whether I was going to play it or not in order to keep him from doing something stupid. Why would I give that card away?
I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. And I would just say, if any viewers are super interested in this, if you look at the nuclear posture review from 2018, it lays out a strong case for not forswearing first use, because what you really want is no use ever, right? That's what you really, really want. And you especially can imagine these days where you would have massive attacks, for example, on communications infrastructure that would maybe affect your ability to strike back from a nuclear perspective. And therefore, if you forswear first use, you might be opening yourself up to be very vulnerable for first use by a hostile power like Russia or China. So
let me chime in with Glenn here. So there's this thing called the trembling hand equilibrium, which Glenn will recognize. The reason is mutual assured destruction makes no sense at all in game theory, because there's no reason, if they go send 3 nukes your way, there is no reason for the United States to murder tens of millions of Chinese or Russians, and a good chance we wouldn't do it. So you need to make sure there's just, you're pretty rational, but you never know, guys, so don't do anything too dumb.
One of the odder things about the way nuclear strategy evolved during the Cold War was that while there were some strategists who believed we were in some kind of mutual balance of terror, in truth, NATO doctrine became one of limited nuclear war. There were short-range tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. HR knows this better than anyone on this call.
I used to have to pass the exam because we had nuclear 8-inch rounds,
right,
artillery rounds in our cavalry regiment.
This is one of the stranger and less well understood features of the Cold War, that we were ready to use those tactical nuclear weapons because we couldn't have stopped the Red Army with purely conventional forces. So it actually is highly relevant today, given that we have a new domain of warfare, cyber warfare. And HR, I'd love you to talk a little bit about deterrence in cyberspace, because my working assumption for some years, based on arguments with Joe Nye at Harvard, is that there is no deterrence in cyberspace per se. In other words, you can't really deter people from engaging in cyber attacks unless you have the credible threat to retaliate in a non-cyber, potentially nuclear way. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree completely, right? I mean, I think what you have to do for deterrence is deterrent in 2 ways fundamentally. Deterrence by denial, which is persuading your enemy that your enemy cannot accomplish his objectives through any form of attack, right? So you can do that with resilient systems, layered defenses within cyberspace, but also, of course, you can't have a defense in cyberspace without offensive cyber capabilities, because you can't shoot down all the arrows. You have to be able to kill the archer in cyberspace. But then also we have to be able to deter by the threat of punitive action later. And that punitive action has to go outside of the cyber domain and enter into the physical domain. It may be, depending on the circumstances, appropriate use of military force, but it's also law enforcement and sanctions. And we do this routinely now, much better than we used to in terms of going after malicious cyber actors. The real problem is when you're facing a capable cyber actor that is not a nation state, and therefore it is more difficult to hold something of value to that actor at risk. And that's where I think we have to be very active at going after organizations who have these capabilities so that they can't attack our more vulnerable infrastructure. But, I think it's really two-pronged for us, right? Deterrence by denial, making our systems more resilient, and then being able to go after cyber actors, as you're mentioning, outside of cyberspace. Now, I'll tell you a very early example of this. This is not a very tactical level, but there were a number of cyber actors associated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in our area of operation in Nineveh province. And we found that one of the most effective remedies to that was a 500-pound bomb at the physical location of that cyber actor. So I think it's just one of many examples of how to use really capabilities outside of the cyber domain to deter or defeat cyber actors.
Okay, I want to turn in our last couple of minutes because we have, it turns out, two economists here that are better than me. Neil turns out to be one of them. Neil wrote a great Bloomberg piece that I encourage you all to read about the current situation. And we got so much going on. We got these massive bills going through Congress. We got inflation. We have a new Federal Reserve chair and vice chair, it looks like. And we have the big puzzle of why people are not returning to work. So maybe Neil can tee this off since you wrote it, but I want Glenn also to step up on what's going on here.
Well, I'll keep it short. First, I'm not a better economist than you, John, but I've learned a lot from you since moving out here 5 years ago.
You wrote a better essay than I can write.
I owe you a debt if I'm understanding.
And hey, I'm still expecting college credit from you guys on economics.
You got to pass the final exam.
And secondly, very briefly, the puzzle of the economy at the moment is partly that the labor market looks very tight, but there are like 4 or maybe you could even argue 7 million missing jobs, if you just imagine where we would be if there'd not been a pandemic. And so I was asked, can you resolve this conundrum? And my resolution of it was quite straightforward. I said, first of all, this pandemic is over, and yet it's not over. It feels like it's over, but for a lot of people, it's not over. That is why they're holding back from returning into employment. Maybe they're taking early retirement because they're in their mid-50s and they're like, okay, I don't think I really want to go back to work after all. Maybe they're just confined to home because their kids are still being sent home when anybody tests positive in a school. So there's definitely a labor supply constraint, which I think reflects the late pandemic phase. But the other thing that's going on, which dominates in my view, is that the economy's been massively overstimulated on the fiscal and monetary side. And yeah, I dare to say it on a GoodFellows show. Larry Summers was right. Back in February, he said, this stimulus is out of all proportion to the plausible output gap. If you do this, fellow Democrats, you're going to have an inflation problem. Here we are. Latest inflation read is 6.2%. I'll say it again, 6.2% consumer price inflation. Summers was right. And that is why the economy looks a little weird at the moment. Last point, if you were full of the joys of spring back the early part of this year with the economy rallying and wages looking buoyant, you've had a rude awakening because inflation's gone up more than average earnings have. And so in real terms, labor compensation's down. The big winners of Joe Biden's policy for the middle class and working families turn out to be the super rich and the owners of all the assets that have gone up by much, much more than wages or prices.
We do have to credit Summers, not because he also changed his mind. This was Mr. Secular Stagnation, more stimulus for 10 years. And he changed his mind. I've been an inflation hawk, but I've always been an inflation hawk. So it's like, there's no news there.
I think Larry Summers would say the two positions are consistent, that you can still believe in secular stagnation and think that they crazily overreduced the stimulus earlier this year. But Glenn.
What you just said is we have stagflation. We're having inflation, But yet, even though 10 million job openings, 7 million unemployed, but still the total amount of people working and the size of the economy is well below where it should be now. Glenn.
Well, I'm struck by the fact that how do you end a pandemic? How do you end the moral panic, if you'll allow me to put it that way, that surrounds the pandemic? And I mean, I want to say, let's call the whole thing off. There was a song to that effect. We need somebody to wave a banner and say it's over. Maybe that's Dr. Fauci. Maybe if Dr. Fauci comes out and says, I was just kidding, it's okay. We can go back. So that's one thing. There's a lot of money floating around. I was just talking to Larry Kotlikoff, the economist, at my podcast, and he's very, very concerned about the fiscal insolvency long-term of the country and about the possibility of more inflation around the corner, given the amount of money that's floating around. There's a lot of money floating around. We were even reciting the quantity theory equation, PQ equals MV, and he's talking about expectations of future inflation and that it stimulates the velocity of money, which feeds into current inflation and all that kind of stuff. So, but the Biden administration are determined, are they not, to be Roosevelt 2.0 and to lay down some kind of framework of social investments that will endure in the history books as a reenactment of the welfare state, and they intend to do it on a 50-50 Senate, and before the clock runs out and the House flips the other way,
Maybe get Carter 2.0. I certainly noticed what Neil knows. Our government printed up $2.5 trillion of money and sent people checks. It borrowed another $2.5 trillion of money and sent people checks. Milton Friedman called this a helicopter drop. We just tried it. So that we're getting inflation is no surprise. What's amazing is the Fed, whose job is supposed to be, what's the Fed supposed to do? What's the supply? Calibrate the demand, notice if there's not enough supply for the demand. And they still have not noticed that this is a problem. I went back to read the November 3 meetings. They're still providing support and stimulating because they don't think the labor market's strong enough.
John, you may have worried people by saying we have a new Fed chair. We actually have the old Fed chair who's getting a second term. And you watch how Jay Powell flips from dove to hawk now that he's had that confirmation that he's still got a job. I think he's going to be getting a phone call probably every 2 days from Ron Klain, who is, of course, our prime minister, saying, hey, inflation's hurting us, Jay. The reason you got renewed was to sort this mess out. So my sense is that we're heading for a much more hawkish Fed now, and that we'll probably end up having to correct this problem with a rather painful slowdown. By the way, the other person who's vindicated, and Tyler Cowen, who's been a guest on this show, said it, is Milton Friedman. And that's what you were talking about with the other Larry, the great Larry Kotlikoff, Glenn. This is Friedman's world after all, and a major monetary policy mistake has been made. And it's pretty hard to unmake those mistakes if the expectations genie is out the bottle, which I think it is.
Yeah, well, I was trained at MIT and we were taught that Uncle Milty had it all wrong, but that was 45 years ago. And I got a lot of respect for Milton Friedman and for Robert Lucas and for Tom Sargent and for a number of other guys that we could name. John Cochrane.
Well, I'll put in the John Cochrane. This isn't just about money. In Milton Friedman's world, if they had bought lots of treasuries, not increased the debt overall, and turned it into money, that would cause inflation. This was because they were also printing up treasuries. So the deep, hard problem is that this is about way too much debt overall, whether treasury debt or overnight debt at the Federal Reserve. And that's the Federal Reserve alone cannot put that back in the bottle. But I'll second your view. Powell is a very sophisticated guy, and I'm very impressed on how well he understands all the technical monetary policy stuff, and very good at Washington. So he did what it takes to keep his job, and I think once that's secure, we may see some interesting policy. And we're leaving out the most important thing. What the Fed is about now is regulation. Is the Fed going to take on climate change, inequality, and racial justice, or is the Fed going to go back to worrying about inflation? That's the still unsettled. The Fed has expanded to this enormous do everything agency, and we'll see just where that goes. Okay, I'm being told it's time to wrap up.
This has got to be the wrap up time.
Yes, it's the wrap up time. So the wrap up question. What's the best Thanksgiving food and what's the worst Thanksgiving food? I'll lead while you guys think about it. Of course, around the Farmer Cochrane house, we are planning lasagna with chicken cutlets, the most traditional Italo-American Thanksgiving possible.
Well, we immigrants really struggle with Thanksgiving. I mean, from a British perspective, it's just spoiling your appetite for Christmas. So I have never really got my head around Thanksgiving. I'm bound to be confronted by turkey, and I'm bound to feel in my heart of hearts, this is a month too soon. Wait already for Christmas turkey.
Well, we're having a fried turkey for Thanksgiving centerpiece. Fortunately, we're not frying it ourselves. My lovely wife has ordered our fried turkey from her favorite dispensary in Texas. It arrived on dry ice the other day, and I'm looking forward to it. The worst I can imagine is one of these puddings made from sweet potatoes with the melted marshmallows and the butter floating around in it. It almost gives me a heart attack thinking about it.
Hey, Jared, last.
Hey, well, I love Thanksgiving, man. How do you not love Thanksgiving? Come on, Neil. I mean, I'll give you a little bit more time as an American, man, before you get into it. But
I know I should.
And hey, I love turkey, man. If it's a good moist turkey, and then I'll tell you, Glenn, my mom used to make this great sweet potato casserole. It was not too sweet, and the marshmallows were very crispy on the top, which I liked. It was kind of a texture thing as well. So I just got to defend the old sweet potatoes with the marshmallows on top a little bit.
Well, Thanksgiving is also about giving thanks, and one of the many things I'm thankful for this year is the company of my GoodFellows and the larger community of GoodFellows. Glenn, it's a pleasure to have you, and
thank you.
I'll be back soon. Thankful for.
I look forward to it.
All of you.
Hey, thankful for you guys.
Good to see HR. Neil.
Thanks, Glenn.
Entirely mutual.
For all the GoodFellows and for the Hoover Institution, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.